This is the word of the Lord.
Good morning, everyone. As is my custom each time I come to visit you, once or twice a year, I thank David for taking leave so I have the opportunity to worship with you. Thank you, David, for taking some leave. It's lovely to be with you. Lyle sends her best wishes. My wife, she's in Melbourne today helping a friend establish a new home in Melbourne. And she sends her love and sorry that she can't be with us. Janet and Susan, thank you for your... I will send them back. Thank you for your leadership in worship this morning. It's been an honour to be a part of it. Thank you to the band. And to James for reading that abridged version. That was my choice, the abridged version. It's quite a long reading. I wanted to get the gist, the nub, the sense of it without necessarily doing all 18 verses. So thank you, James, for that. It's Australia Day, of course, January 26th, but given I don't get to visit with you very often these days, I thought I'd tell you a bit about some of what life and ministry at the Wayside Chapel has been like in the last year or so since I've been in ministry. Wayside, for those who don't know, is not far away in King's Cross. Celebrated our 60th anniversary this year. What started as a fairly kind of experimental kind of church in the 60s when the Cross was becoming or had become the red light district of Sydney and the place where all the drugs that were entering from the warships that would land down at birth down at Woolloomooloo would be brought up into the Cross, and the Cross became that kind of place in Sydney where all the underbelly stuff, as so goes the TV shows named after that kind of stuff. That was what was happening in the Cross. And of course today rapidly gentrifying, significant new buildings going up, but still the kind of place where somebody having perhaps the worst day of their life might know, well, at least I can go to Wayside. And indeed we have people, more and more people coming. It's not. It's sad to say our services aren't less needed now than they ever had been. In fact, our call for food and help with food has tripled in the last 18 months, and there have been times where we've had to close our cafe just because there's no food left to give. It's a bit of a whatever the politicians and the media say about the cost of living. Come and spend a day at Wayside and you can find out a bit about are things going tough or not. There's a good indicator by the need for access of our services. But this passage is really important both to me and to us at Wayside because of the way in which it tells an ancient story, but that feels not so ancient if we let it come back to us. And as Susan said, there's been stories here on this land since time immemorial. This story we hear is about somewhere between 6,000 to 8,000 years old. We don't know exactly when the book of Ruth was written, but it's guessed at about 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. And it's a story of tragedy, a story of great pain, but also a story of hope, a story of great love, and the way in which all things can and are being made new, hence why it's an important story for both me and for us at Wayside. And a story of people living in a strange country, people who'd moved from one country to another. Indeed, the story of Elimelech and Naomi is of a story of migrants moving to another country because of a famine in their own land and the need to find the possibility of a new future. And they move, husband and wife and 2 sons, to a foreign land, and their sons marry local women. The story of the Israelites and the Moabites is a complicated one. I'm not going to go much into it today, but to say, can we just grant in the story they don't get on generally, as often neighbours want to do? That the cultures weren't the same culture necessarily, and so the Israelites coming into the Moabite lands and marrying local women might have been the cause of some consternation. Can we let that be a big story we can all imagine and then move on to the next part of the story? But I just want to acknowledge it. I want to acknowledge that they both marry locals. And then the story doesn't go into a huge amount of detail, but it tells us that all the men folk die, essentially. The husband, the father, and then the two sons all die, leaving a mother-in-law to two daughters, a mother and her two daughters-in-law from different cultural backgrounds. It's only the three of them left. And in the culture of that day, there's no way for that family unit to make its way in the world. There's no economic possibility. There's no welfare opportunity. They've lost their mechanism to make their way. And so the mother-in-law, Naomi, says to her two daughters-in-law, "You have been beautiful, wonderful daughters-in-law, but it's time for you to go back to your families of origin. You've looked after me, you've helped us look after our dead, but it's time for you to go home." And with that going home, perhaps even the chance to remarry once more. But there's no way for us to make our way. So thank you, she says to her daughters, but you're released from your obligations. You can go back to your families of origin. And neither of the daughters particularly like this, Orpah or Ruth. Neither of them welcome that message, but Orpah does indeed go back to her family of origin. And Ruth says those beautiful lines, those beautiful, beautiful lines. When she says to her mother-in-law, from a different cultural background and really no legal mechanism holding them together anymore, "Don't urge me to leave you or return from following you. From where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." It's a beautiful story of love beyond borders of culture, and love being that force that enables us to hold together beyond the barriers or beyond the boundaries that would come to separate us one from another. A beautiful story of daughter-in-law and mother-in-law being chosen family together, because now there is no legal instrument for them to remain family, but they say, "We are family." Ruth says, "I am your family. Wherever you go, I will go. I will be with you." A beautiful declaration of loyalty and love. One of the great things that I've learnt more about since being at Wayside is the ways in which Wayside, the amount of weddings that happened in Wayside back in the 60s and 70s was pretty incredible. It was the only place, the only chapel in Sydney that would marry people if they were previously divorced, or if they were of different religious backgrounds or of no religious background. You could get married at a town hall, at a registry office, but no church would allow people often to get married. And as the tales go of Wayside becoming known as one of the places people could go that would accept people who wanted to get married that other churches had said no to. These great stories, particularly of the stories go that on a Saturday, Ted Noffs would run weddings on the half hour every Saturday, doing 15 or 16 weddings on a Saturday, which is kind of hard to get your head around. And if you do get your head around, you probably picture, well, that sounds a bit like, like a wedding chapel in Vegas or something, just kind of moving people through. But the stories are told of how Ted and the Wayside people made every couple feel like they were the only people in the universe right then in that moment as they got married. That it wasn't a insert name of person here as we say the words and just shovel people through. It was a rich and beautiful celebration for each couple. People still remember the stories to their day and have told those stories to a playwright, Alana Valentine, a Sydney playwright who's written both a play about Wayside brides and now a book called Wed by the Wayside, capturing the stories of the hundreds, thousands of people who were married at Wayside in the 60s and 70s in particular. Before I tell you one of the stories, because I just love this story I want to tell you, but one of the stories, one of the old-time former street people who's still a part of the Wayside community, grew up on the streets around that time. He said he and the other kids of the cross would always head up on a Saturday evening because he would whip out a wad of cash from his pocket from the people who just paid him for weddings and peel off a note and give it to the street kids who came to him on a Saturday night. They always knew Saturday night was the night to hit up Ted. You might end up with a nice note in your hand after a day's worth of weddings at the Wayside. An incredible and beautiful image. But Alana Valentine, the playwright and now writer of a book as well, has written this amazing story that I wanted to share with you of the wedding of Shandor and Del Ponusami as told by their son Kumar. He wrote to Alana because she'd put a broadcast out for anyone who had stories to tell about being married at Wayside in those days. And the son of a couple wrote in, and he wrote, "My father was a Hindu, my mother was a Christian, and the Wayside was the only church that would marry them back in the day. It was a very well celebrated wedding. It featured in both the newspaper and on the news that evening." Right? It featured on I'm not sure what channel, but the news. It was very well celebrated. The Malaysian-Australian singer Kamal performed at their reception. And his mother was given away by a fashion mogul of the day, Joseph Brenda. He sent in a photo from their wedding with them both wearing white with varmalas, big decorative flower garlands around their necks exchanged during Hindu wedding ceremonies, and a pink dyed poodle at their feet. I'm not sure if that was a touch from the Hindu or Christian tradition. I don't know where the pink dyed poodle came from. The author, Alana, asked him about how their families of origin felt about them getting married. And Kumar said, "Not everyone in the family was proud of them. My grandparents disapproved of it. They wouldn't go. So that really hurt them terribly. But they had a big procession down Hughes Street. They had a big white Jag and flowers all over the bonnet, and eventually the flowers stained the brand new Jaguar, colour running out of the flowers. And then as Kamal arrived in his pristine cream suit, the pink poodle jumped up onto him and stained his suit with blotches of pink dye." She asked him a little bit more about how they managed to make their way, given they didn't have the blessing of their families of origin. And Kumar went on to tell a story that in his own life, in his own story, when he was 17, he had a daughter with a Croatian girl, and her family were very pro-Croatian, he said, and they expected her to marry a Croatian man, and they didn't approve of him at all. He went to his mother and said, how did you make your way when your parents weren't blessing your relationship? Kumar says, "Mum said to me, wait till they have a grandchild. They won't be able to keep on with that behaviour, whether it's full Croatian or a part Indian baby." And it was true. And I remembered that as a child, I remembered back to when I was a child, said Kumar, both sets of grandparents loved each of us children immensely. They couldn't have loved us if there was still any racism left in them at that point, he said. Alana wrote in the book, "I was happy to pay witness to the courage to face the world that Kumar drew from his family's own experience. And that his knowledge that the source of his life was a joyful, transgressive, pink-stained, tradition-defying ceremony that was embraced and marvelled at by those who were there at the Wayside Chapel that day." What a beautiful story. The story of Ruth and Naomi reminds us that love crosses boundaries that we choose to make. That love crosses borders that we consider to be legitimate, but in the human experience and in the way God thinks about us are not legitimate. Love breaks those kinds of boundaries and instead keeps people connected across the boundaries that we choose to put up. I have heard a couple of amazing stories this winter. I heard the story, John, our senior pastor, John Owen, stood up in church one day and said, "I heard from one of the congregation yesterday who rang me to say why she can't be in church today, and this is now the bar that anyone has to clear should they ever not be able to come to church. So everyone's thinking, oh, okay, better listen up. The bar's being set. If we can't come to church, here it is. John tells a story of a woman in the community who had 20 years ago had a baby on the streets. And Graham Long, the pastor at the time, had handed her money out of his pocket to make sure she always had enough to feed not herself, but her baby, her little one, and keep her in nappies and the like. And he organised for other local people to help make sure it was possible for her to survive until she managed to get housing. This woman, 20 years later, today is the one who's on the other end of the phone saying, I can't come to church tomorrow to John. Oh, really? How come? Oh, the Department of Family Services has just rung to say that a baby has been abandoned in Central Station toilet this week, and they have no one to look after, and they're asking me to take her on and make her part of my family. And I'm picking her up tomorrow. John said, that's the bar for missing church. If somebody rings you and says, we need you to claim an abandoned baby and take her in, you're allowed to miss church. So just so you know what the bar is, apparently that's the bar. John said to her, make sure once you've got her in and got her settled, bring her here to Wayside. And the whole community couldn't wait to meet this little one and to shower her and this family with love. She's been baptized now. Her name is Angel. And she's a part of the community at Wayside. And her mum, having lived this story 20 years earlier with her own child, is now able to bring in another child, someone else's child, and make her her own. And say, you are my child. I will love you with all the love that is within me. And a community that would surround her and say, we will love you with all the love that is within us. A beautiful image, and of course not a dry eye in the house as we baptized little Angel and made her part of the community. Claimed that God's love for her is as powerful now as it always has been for every moment she's been alive. That winter, we also had Josh, a guy who used to live on the streets with a significant drug problem, whose life had been saved by the medically supervised injecting centre. He now has a partner and a child and a job and a house. But there was a time for many years there where his life was precarious and hanging by a thread. Every winter in the lead up, he works overtime. He works construction and he works overtime deliberately. And he takes every dollar that he earns in that overtime and buys blankets and sleeping bags and arrives at Wayside with his car stuffed full. And he takes them one by one and brings them into the community service centre. Josh, why are you doing this? He says, because it's bloody cold on the streets in winter. I remember what that's like. And I just want to do my bit to make things better for those who come after me. It's not good for Josh to hang around the cross very much. He goes to church, but not with us. It's good that he doesn't come back to the cross much. The cross was the scene for him of much of the struggle in his life. But he comes back every year, at least every year, making sure he brings with him, like I said, blankets and sleeping bags to make his contribution to try to help those who are still struggling on the streets. That barrier that he needs to create by not being on the cross gets crossed by him in order to come back and share love with the people each winter. It's a beautiful indication of that love that we know, that love of God that transcends any boundary for the good of blessing those we would love together. Ruth's powerful declaration, wherever you go, I will go. We see that magic of chosen family, and the church is a kind of chosen family. We're here not because we must, not because we have to, but because we choose to. Because we discover in offering love to one another who are not blood, but who are yet family, we discover a way of being in the world that is more rich and more precious and more nourishing to us than just that kind of life that would only look after ours and our own. We have two congregations at Wayside, King's Cross and Bondi. And a couple of weeks ago, we had a layperson leading worship. And every so often, he'll go off tangent. You just have to go with it. he said, I want to interview a couple of members of the congregation. It wasn't in the script, it wasn't in the order of service for the day, but it's okay. All right, he's following the Spirit, we say, hoping that's what's happening. And he brings up a couple to interview them. They're relatively new to the congregation. And he's asking them about their life, their story, and it's wonderful. If I was the kind of person that was watching the clock, I'd be stressed, because there's a certain amount of things that have to happen in a certain amount of time, but we chose not to be stressed. And he says to the couple, have you had a story in your life of coming back to faith, of coming back to church, of coming back to your journey with God in however you understand it? And the woman said, well, I was lying in a hospital bed as a quadriplegic with no way out of this, and all I knew how to do was to pray out to God to ask for help, to say that I don't know how to get through this, but I want your help. There's a woman standing in front of the congregation. I don't think any of us had knew that she had been a quadriplegic at one point. She's standing there. So you can imagine the crowd being a bit, wow, hang on. There's a whole story there, because she didn't give us the whole story. She just told us I was a quadriplegic and I called out for help. And now that's my coming back to faith story. Hang on, we're going to need a bit more information at some point. But Phil says, yeah, sis, I know exactly what you're talking about. I was in prison and I didn't know what to do, and I called out to God and I said, if you help me figure out what's next, if you help me figure out a way through, I'll come back to that which I know is the truest story in my life, the story of faith, the story of journeying together with you, God. I could have had any plans thrown out the window for the rest of worship. We just had at the beginning of worship 2 stories that were gobsmacking in their both beauty, but also in their incredibleness. So this story of transformation of one a quadriplegic, one in prison, talking about how when they didn't know what to do next, they at least knew who to turn to. And in the Ruth and Naomi story, we have that same impetus, nourished. This ancient story that we still tell today is retold because it reminds us they didn't know what to do next. All they knew was that they should hang together. Those of you who've been well trained in church, have done Sunday school over the years, can you remember anything about what happens with the Ruth and Naomi story? Why do we anyone know why we keep telling the Ruth story? Why is she important? She's important enough for this story. Robin, why? Well, just a little. Exactly right. So she becomes the great-grandmother to King David, Ruth, starting with this, I have nothing but a mother-in-law left. If you read the rest of the book, it's not that big. This is your teaser. Go and read the rest of the book of Ruth. She will end up being married and having children. She becomes the great-grandmother of King David, who is in the line of Jesus. And she's named at the beginning of the Gospels as one of the forebears of Jesus. This woman who loses her husband and sister-in-law and father-in-law and brothers-in-law is left with nothing but mother-in-law. She doesn't know what to do next, but she does know who. And she says, I am sticking with you, Naomi, and your God will be my God, and whatever happens next, we will figure it out. I'm paraphrasing. That's not the exact words that you heard read to you. When we don't know what, do we know who? And there's a beautiful symbol and sign in this story that, yes, Ruth goes on to become a key matriarch, a key figure in King David's story, and therefore in Jesus' story. At this moment of hopelessness that we contemplate for a minute, we're reminded that in those hopelessnesses, if we know who to turn to, if we know who we're traveling with, then even if we don't know what, we have more than enough to make a start. We'll be coming to the table momentarily. We're going to sing a song in just a moment, and then we're going to share communion together. And as we share communion, we're reminded that all are welcome. There's no boundaries at this table. There's no barriers. There's no requirement that you pass any kind of test in order to be welcome here. Everybody is welcome here because that's who Jesus is and what Jesus continues to offer as part of the family of faith and to the family of all humanity. All are welcome, regardless of the barriers, regardless of the boundaries. So as we come today, we will join in this ritual that has been marked for thousands of years to remind us of that key truth. The chosen families save lives, and the church is a kind of chosen family where we love not because we have to, but because we get to. And in that getting to love one another, we discover a life fully worth living.